Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Talk to, Not At. Now, for those who are just joining us, I am your host, Abby, and this show is produced by the Debate Boutique Network. Now, this episode, I think we're going to ruffle a few feathers, a little bit more than what I probably am going into this expecting, because this episode, we're going to talk about astrology. Now, I had, not too recently, but I had my birthday a little over a month ago, and I myself am a Sagittarius. So when my birthday season came around, I was like, oh my goodness, we need to do an episode on astrology, because every time someone was like, oh, it's your birthday, oh, you're a Sag, oh, that's the follow-up, and they're like, I can see it, you definitely give Sag vibes, I love it. I will do the whole Google up what is a Sagittarius, and I always get, right, like that huge rundown that is kind of, to me, still a little vague. Like, you're adventurous, but at the same time, like, you're still very firm-pudding and all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, so this really can go anyway. Like, no wonder it seems like, you know, you can definitely see yourself within each sign, because I'm kind of like, your wording here is a little vague to me. But I get that each sign has their own specific traits, yet I'm not really fully sure that I buy it 100%. Now, I'm not saying I'm someone who's like, oh, like an astrology shamer at all. No, I just always kind of struggled with understanding, right, why did I not really like launch onto this astrology wave the same way that some of my friends were able to grasp it and understand it, and other coworkers and social media, all of these other platforms. I'm like, everyone's getting it but me. So what's my hold up? What am I missing out on? And part of it, right, is me also studying science and biology. I've taken courses and we talked about constellations and all of that good stuff, and I'm like, this stuff is always changing. So how am I supposed to be, you know, solid in something that, I mean, recently we just added a whole other new zodiac sign to the 12-year calendar, or 12-month calendar. So I'm like, I don't really know how I can just trust in something or completely believe something when I recognize all of these other factors shape or manipulate how it is that we understand astrology in that moment. So I was like, let's talk about it, because I'm sure after this episode, there's some things that I learned during my research, but I'm also sure that many of you all can help me understand maybe a little bit more as to why I might have a hold up and fully just like jumping on the astro wave. When I first was talking about or thinking about where are we going with this conversation with astrology, I was sitting here wondering, okay, what's the history of astrology, right? Because I understand that there's a mix between using ancient Greek and ancient Rome, naming of gods and constellations to then like name or identify which gods are associated with which planets, as well as to what signs are associated with certain characteristics or attributes, but also our representations, right, of different like ancient gods as well, right? So you can tell by how I explain that I am not the most like astrology 101 when it comes to history. So I was like, let's start there. And I think some of the information I uncovered began to help me understand in a deeper psychological identity way of why I may be having some holdups when it comes to me fully understanding or being able to grasp this concept of astrology. So we typically think, right, astrology started like ancient Greek, right? We think about all of these philosophers, and we think about, you know, ancient Roman times and how there's all these advancements when it comes to understanding like the calendar and hours in the day, as well as months, as well as the sky, and like using all of these new advancements, right? New advancements in science to help then shape, right, maybe some of these cultural aspects. Well, in reality, astrology goes back way farther than that, okay? So astrology actually started in Mesopotamia with the Babylons. Now, the Babylons, I'm like, okay, I always hear y'all in different, you know, very key cultural historical moments. So when I think of like the history of Christianity, right, I think of Mesopotamia and the Babylons. When I think of not just, ancient Christian history, but when I also think of like Islamic history, or when I also think of Judaism, there are all of these different aspects, right, that we keep seeing Babylon brought up and back into. But that's a little side note, right? We'll get back to that pin later. Now, Mesopotamia was responsible for having their own way of tracking omens, right, or signs, and they were associated, right? The signs were associated with gods, but not actually a representation of the god themselves. So these celestial beings, we can say, right? These celestial omens were the original zodiac signs that were attributed to fixed constellations in the sky. Originally, the Babylons had about 17 to 18 of these different signs, and then that got truncated down to the known 12, which later became adopted, we'll say, right, by other cultures as well. So Mesopotamia had mapped out these different constellations, and they had also, discussed in detail in these many different tablets and like key cultural texts, right, that these certain signs were omens for different things, and then they were also attributed to certain gods. So when we think of the planet Mars, for example, Mars has throughout history been attributed to the god Aries, and has also been attributed to like the zodiac sign Aries, right? And this idea of war, or the god Hades as well, has also been attributed to Mars. Well, in ancient Mesopotamia, Mars still had its ties to the god of war, and then it still had its representation tied to a constellation, which meant that this constellation brings the omen or the warning of war as well. Now we see like some of the same characteristics. I mean, Venus was still attributed to having like being the god of fertility and sexuality, and it was still tied to the same planet, right, Venus, and then also had a constellation that was also known as like one of these celestial representations of this planet or of this sky. So Mesopotamia had many of these same foundations that we see in Western current understandings of astrology. Yet Babylon had such cultural influence at this time. I mean, in ancient Mesopotamia, this community was thriving in terms of goods, resources, language, right, arts. When we think of science, clearly, because they are also recognized for like being some of the first individuals to map out constellations and to actually track the entirety, like the calendar, the entirety of the year, right? How to use the constellations to map what time period in the year are we in. So this influence that they had was something that spread all throughout North Africa and what is now known as the Middle East, right? So not only are they spreading their influence in terms of the riches of the culture that they have, but along with that culture, we also have the spreading of this understanding of what the constellations mean, these omens that the constellations represent, and the gods that they are tied to. So Egypt becomes one of the first, or one of the new areas that adopt this cultural practice and integrate it into their own system. Now during this time, right, as well, colonization is still a thing. Okay, so that's not something that ever stopped. So ancient Greece decides, hey, we're going to start colonizing areas of North Africa. And during this process of colonization by ancient Greece, we then have Greece also colonize parts of Egypt, which is where they have some of their first interactions with this Babylonian understanding of the stars and astrology. So rather than, I don't want to say admiring from afar, but rather than giving credit to where it's due, ancient Greece totally takes this, steals it, brings it back to their own community, revamps it, replaces all of the traditional Babylonian names with Greek names and their own gods, and then puts a trademark stamp on it and is like, yeah, this is our thing. We came up with astrology. It was our philosophers who really understood the mapping of the stars and also these different events that typically happen, and they're tied to our gods as well. So now Greek mythology took over astrology and totally whitewashed it all. So we have all of the black and brown history behind astrology like erased, right? As though they aren't even the same thing anymore. Because one of the things that I think it's important to mention now is that what gives astrology some of its weight is empirics, right? It's not just a statement of, oh, during this type of celestial event, then this type of thing may occur, right? It's because there are empirics that speak to the truth of whatever meaning is given to each constellation, to the different planets, right? That there are certain events that repeat themselves in different ways that add value or weight or truth to our understanding of astrology. And at the same time, when we also have these repeated events, that also means there's fluctuation. So there can be some fluidity into how we interpret or understand based at the time frame that we are currently in, or whatever multitude of celestial events are happening at the same time. So there still is some interpretation, right, to understanding what astrology is trying to speak to you. So that's just kind of like something that, to put a pin in, right? So now we're at the point Greece has totally revamped astrology. It also is something that becomes shared with Rome. Rome also does some revamping, which is why we have Greek gods used on one side and then Roman gods used on another side when it comes to understanding constellations versus planets, right? It kind of becomes this cross-cultural tandem between ancient Greek and ancient Rome that really then shapes modern Western astrology. Yet at the same time, right, these ideas, these ideologies were built upon practices of colonization. So during periods of colonization, it was that either new information in terms of astrology was gained, or those empirical events were then used to justify why a certain meaning is what it is when we think of different signs, celestial moments, etc. Okay? So that's kind of just this whole history in terms of astrology now coming to the West. But y'all are probably okay, Abby, what's important? Okay, colonization's a thing. We know that it's probably a given, even if you aren't an astrology type person. But what's the importance of that? Why does that challenge or make it difficult to just digest and accept Western astrology? Well, I guess what my main contention became after I was doing some of this history was that this trend of colonization when it comes to stealing important artifacts or knowledge from Black communities isn't something that's just unique to astrology, right? But rather this is something that has happened with every type of ontic moment or category in history. And when I say ontic, I mean things that completely change the trajectory or the orientation or how we understand humanity, right? So this isn't just something that we've seen when it comes to religion, when it comes to science, when it comes to language. It's something that we've seen in every aspect of the new world being shaped. There are pieces that come from Black communities, and that Blackness in it gets completely eradicated. Whiteness swallows it up. It completely reiterates the meaning to then fit an image of Western society that is slowly forming. The image has not been created yet, but something that has to be formed through the digestion of Blackness, and then spits out or regurgitates the information as something that does or serves a purpose to Western society, and then forces an assimilation of the others to that ideology, forces a new digestion of information, so that way it then allows for some type of devalue, dehumanization, or internal desire to reach this impossibility of whiteness, right? It's impossible for someone to exist in the position of blackness to ever reach the position of whiteness. And astrology is one of these tools that was digested, that was taken from black people, taken from brown people, right? Reiterated, rewritten, and then resold to the masses to help create a certain type of superiority for white supremacy. And that doesn't mean that I'm saying there's no validity in astrology, but we're going to get into that next. I kind of just wanted to put out there where I'm headed with this conversation, so I'm saying why it matters to understand the history of where astrology comes from. But before we jump into this next part, I know y'all are probably like, okay, either Abby, I think you have no idea what you're talking about, because I can tell that you was not, again, an astro head, but at the same time, I'm kind of curious where we're going with this, because you put out a huge statement saying that white supremacy basically re-articulated astrology to make it, one, digestible to Western culture, but then two, during that digestion, to justify anti-blackness. And I need to see where we're going with this. So wherever you are in terms of this conversation right now, let's take a second. Let's think about, why history can matter. Let's think about what's our own interpretation of astrology. Let's kind of play around with the thought of where are we going with this, right? Take a moment, digest what we talked about when we were just updating, and let's breathe. Had a moment to kind of upload ourselves into this conversation, think about the history that we talked about, why that history might matter, as well as read that quote that flashed up on the screen for us. Now that quote came from Alice Sparkly Katz, and I need to make sure I give a major shout out to them before we go into this upload portion, because Alice wrote a book, Post-Colonial Astrology, and that book has really helped me during my research journey untangle the language that I was trying to find to explain the discomfort that sits with me when it comes to discussing astrology, especially after knowing more about astrology's history and where astrology actually came from, aka black people. So I really thought that quote, right, kind of summarized what it was that we were talking about in the update portion just minutes ago, when I kind of made this statement, this leaving statement, that astrology is one of the many tools that have been taken or were created by black people, had it taken the blackness erased and eradicated from it, and then resold or reused as a tool for white supremacy. Now, that sounds like, again, where's all this coming from? But when Alice says Western astrology, Plato, and Valens are all things that preceded the invention of the West but became Western in the present, that is exactly what I'm getting at, right? That it was something that existed throughout history, but then was used, right, by the West or by colonization. At the time, really England, right, was used during these periods of colonization to then help lay foundations or be a tool to help establish a new world order, which became the West. And during that process of establishing the world order, there was justification of events that happened that harmed, eradicated, inflicted genocide onto marginalized populations, i.e. others, which then only gave more coherency to white supremacy. Now, we've talked about this conversation in terms of laws and morals and even a little bit in terms of religion when we've had conversations in previous episodes, right, such as the Olympic episode or such as the R. Kelly episode, and we talked about the ways that we define what is morally acceptable and how when we had this period of enslavement and this period of colonization, I mean, we're still in those periods, right? We just are existing post-plantation, but we still are on the plantation. If you know what I mean, you know what I mean. But anyway, we've talked about how to establish this new world order that was built off of violence, death, genocide, and dehumanization of the other, specifically black and brown people, then that new world order had to establish a moral code or a cultural acceptance for that violence to still allow for those beings to be seen as divine human beings, right? As more like humanitarians, as morally accepting. So we've kind of gone through that conversation. I mean, even we get into it pretty well when we have our episode where we're talking about mass shootings and school shootings, right? Where we talk about how all these psychological factors influence, right, the ways that events happen throughout history, but also help us understand the importance of why certain things had to happen a certain way, right, to establish that the white male was the higher moral superior being. Not only does it happen with things that seem very apparent in terms of laws or moral code or the actual ways that we created stereotypes or characterizations of different individuals, but also it comes at the same time with other cultural aspects. And in this instance, we're talking about how that also happens with astrology. Okay, so not only was astrology used, right, to help create or manifest the West, but we talked about earlier, right, these empirics. Now, empirics are used to give validity to statements of Western astrology, right? So just like during ancient Mesopotamia, where when we thought of fertility, it wasn't always something in terms of Venus about sexualization, but it also had a lot to do with times of planting crops or times of cultivating crops, right? Or the most likely chances that a child would survive. There were other meanings to the concept of Venus and fertility or sexuality that didn't have this desire-based concept. Now, during the establishment of the New World Order, when we think of astrology, we also had this attachment to women are from Venus and men are from Mars, and there became the sexualization that happened to the concept of Venus, right? Of this idea of beauty, of lust, of genitalia, or all of these other more sexual aspects that became the characterization for how it was more so to understand this new reinterpretation of this celestial being, right? So part of that, why does that matter, right? What's the benefit of that? Well, the benefit of that is it helps establish the ways in which we understand white womanhood. Because there's different languages that speak to different people, right? So when you are someone who really digests astrology, and that is something that you use to help navigate your life or to understand cultural norms, then there still has to be some superiority of what is the desirable, lustful, beautiful, feminine body that gets inscribed into astrology. So we now see this level of sexual desire and what type of body is desirable, and that is articulated through like this new sexualization of Venus and the images that are literally painted of her, right, attributing to the goddess that she is. We see these images in terms of long blonde hair, right? A petite, slender figure, yet very apparent sexual features. Someone who is pure and white, right? We don't see these images in terms of these gods as being painted as minorities, right? And any other time that you see different representation, it's a spin-off, right? It's somebody doing their own like recreation of this is how I would envision Aphrodite to look. right? She would look this way in terms of something that inserts their own identity or representation into it to make it more culturally acceptable. Yet in terms of the ways that Western society recasted these astrological figures, it had this dual mission to those who bought into the culture to still teach them, to still brainwash them that American Western society is superior through all these little messages. Now, I think Alice Sparkly Katz here is going to explain this a little bit better than me. I'm going to read another quote from the book Post-Colonial Astrology, because it really summarizes where I'm trying to get at, where I'm saying these empirical events that happen that help shape why we understand or we give validity to certain astrological meanings is important, because these empirical events are two-sided, right? It seems to give benefits in terms of astrology and white supremacy, but it comes at a cost of harm. Now, Sparkly Katz writes, it must consider, and when I say it must, Sparkly Katz is referring to an understanding of astrology, right? It must consider Jupiter's progress in technology while understanding that pollution wrecks the poor countries so rich countries can continue to be rich. It has to understand that Venus's and Mars' sexual power was extracted from the bodies of people of color through a rape culture that consisted mostly of white men raping black and brown people, but that framed things to make it seem as if the problem was that brown and black men posed a sexual threat to white women. I'm going to pause right there and come back to this quote. That was the part that we were just talking about, where we're talking about Venus's sexual desire and how that gets instilled onto now a new understanding of what is desirable. And what was desirable was the white woman. So the white woman, right, the pure body, the representation of what was attributed to Venus, to this celestial being, right, is that it's so desirable that it also means that black and brown men are going to be animalistic in terms of attempting to, like, have access to that woman, right? That they are going to rape her, they're going to assault her, that they are dangerous, they are a threat, they are criminal to society, because this sexual desire that white women have is so powerful, it becomes godly. It becomes something that's out of this world. It becomes something that can only be attributed, right, to understanding the sexual desire or power that Venus holds, which is, I mean, even in ancient Greece, like, we see that the children of certain gods don't really have the best life because of things like sexual assault and rape. And that's something, right, that then gets passed down into a cultural understanding of who is desirable and who is the threat to that person, to that desire. And that threat was the black and brown man, right? Or that threat was the existence of blackness, was a threat to the godliness of white womanhood. Now, to pick up where we left off, right, for astrology to be healing, it can't frame lightness as some abstract form of life, but understand that lightness has a racial context, and that the capitals associated with radiating light are also distributors of death. For astrology to be healing, it must address capital, power, and labor. Now again, that's an excerpt from Post-Colonial Astrology by Alice Sparkly Katz. So I'm really going to just push, like, y'all go buy the book, read the book. It's really amazing if this is something that you're interested in, especially if you're really interested in astrology, because Kat themselves is someone who is an astrologist, is someone who really believes into the different meanings that astrology has and provides for an individual, but it's saying that the lens that we have to use has to be a lens that addresses capital, power, and labor. And that last part that that Katz was talking about, where they're saying that it can be healing, but we have to understand this delineation, right, of light and dark contains this racialized context, right? All of those factors are important into understanding what it is that we're really digesting or accepting when we accept something into our lives. So when we look at the concept of astrology and we think about the concept of you want lightness in your life, you want beauty in your life, and you want to try to turn away from the darkness, there still is a racial context in terms of the establishment of language, words, and morality that were crucial to establishing white supremacy, that depended on creating this image, this racialized image, this stereotypical image, this violent image of black and brown people. So when we think of lightness as beautiful, right, as something that is holy, as something that is healing, as something that is powerful, as something that is good, it also means, in contrast, darkness is the opposite. Now, when we look at a racial context, right, we see that white is literally held in tandem with lightness, right, with good. And then we see blackness is held in tandem to darkness, right, and evil. And how these same ways that we trade language, we trade words, we trade understanding, and whether we're talking about astrology, morals, or legality, are these same terms and languages are not something that can be severed from the positionalities that are tied to give coherency to that language, to give meaning to those words. So these empirical events that happen throughout history that coincide with how we understand a certain astrological term or a zodiac sign or a celestial event, or even the way that we understand language, or that we understand structures, or that we understand each other. All of these different aspects, all of these empirical events, right, were used to create something. And that's what we get to with Katz's point that we had read on the screen during our small breathe moment of the astrology was created for the West before the West even existed, right? It was westernized before the West was even able to exist, because that footing was required to establish an international understanding of who is the other and who is the superior. And then as that culture was being established, it justified further colonization and violence because it was written in the stars, because it was meant to be, because as Darwin would say, it's survival of the fittest. Now, all of these different, ideas that we discussed during this, we kind of went, quite a bit through history. We went through some science. We went through different cultural aspects, and we converged on basically this conclusion statement of astrology is not immune to anti-blackness and colonization, but rather has been influenced, molded by these very structures, these empirical events that help us understand what different astrological moments or periods mean, right? What we can use from astrology to help us identify, right, different meanings are still molded, shaped, and crafted based on these exact same structures of oppression that we can recognize maybe in an abstract way, but we like to think that astrology is separate from it. But no, the meanings that are given to things are all tied up with the ways that we understand language, with the ways that we produce knowledge, and with how we've been trained to understand language and produce knowledge. And I think, in all honesty, y'all, while I was able to, kind of just break the surface on this conversation, I really encourage y'all to read this book by Katz, because it's an amazing, full dissection of each of the different zodiac signs, the history or etymology of them, and then bringing it into a full picture of, okay, what is the big picture that we're trying to understand? What lens do we use, and how do we use that lens to talk about astrology? Now, I guess my moral is, right, what's up next? I mean, up next, read the book. But outside of that, right, it's just when we're thinking about cultural moments, or when we're accepting different things into our lives as truth or as real, that we need to always have a critical lens to think about, where is this coming from? What's the full history of this? What is it telling me? Are there hierarchies in place? Why do I understand this type of event as positive and this event as negative? Or who is the first person perspective, right? So if you're thinking of, for example, like if you're thinking of war, right? And we're thinking of the ways in which war has happened, and we're thinking of, oh yes, this may have lined up with this certain astrological moment that was telling that there was going to be these moments happening, then whose perspective are those empirics coming from? Are they coming from those who were harmed, or are they coming from the countries that did the harming, right? Like just really taking some time to go through history, to line up all the facts, to then get what you, to gain a fuller interpretation out of what it is that you are trying to understand. So that we were not just blindly accepting, different cultural trends. And I'm not trying to reduce astrology to a trend, but rather it's something, right, that has been throughout, something used as a guiding factor, a guidebook throughout history. But the way that the West has modernized astrology has turned it into more of a newer cultural trend rather than something that is based on the validity and truth of history, but also the roots in which it came from, right? It becomes another tool to uphold capital, to uphold labor like hierarchies, right? To uphold racial hierarchies. So I guess my takeaway from this is that not only do we read the book, but also that we just dissect more the historical and cultural context of meanings of things, rather than just trying to attribute it to something that is only either scientific or spiritual. Because even those realms have been polluted by anti-blackness, by capitalism, neoliberalism, by ways that we understand gender. But this was kind of, a interesting topic to me. I mean, not kind of, really interesting, because there's a lot of learning that I'm doing as I'm going through looking deeper into astrology, but I also learned a lot about myself. And I learned, that's really where my contention holds. It's not that I don't think the universe holds energy and power and has the ability to influence actions, moments, and periods, but that the perspective that is given when I'm understanding astrology, the whose perspective am I talking about, right? Who are we talking about when I understand astrology? Felt like it was missing blackness. Felt like it wasn't holding the full history of events that have happened in the world and the shifting of moments that have happened in the world within Western astrology. And now I understand why it can't, right? Because there still is a motive or an agenda that the West has, that they have to continue to produce this this self-superior image. And every cultural norm, trend, aspect has to be remanipulated to uphold that trend. Language, laws, culture, religion, spiritualness, all have to speak in the West to white supremacy. But that's not to say that astrology has to be, right, on a white supremacist agenda, because there's a history where it wasn't. And that's a history that I'm interested in learning more about. Now, I hope you all enjoyed this episode, and I can't wait for us to continue to have more conversation. If you have any questions, please always feel free to drop the comments, engage in some conversation, shoot us a DM on our IG page, the talktonotatshow. And please hit subscribe and the notification so that way when we have our next episode coming back to you, you are able to just hop on and watch it, and we can continue having these awesome conversations. Now, thank you again so much for tuning in today, and I hope you all stay safe and stay healthy.